controversial question of how life began has puzzled mankind for thousands of years. There are two schools of thought. One idea is that God is the master of nature, the creator and ruler of the universe, who designed each kind of life on Earth with deliberate intention. This concept is known as creation science, or abrupt appearance. An opposing view, which is predominant in today's society and scientific community, is known as evolution. It teaches that non-living matter unintentionally changed into life and developed with time. Single-celled forms progressed into more complex multi-celled forms, resulting in the ultimate development of man. The principles of evolution influence every aspect of our society. Around the world, prestigious museums display evolutionary perspectives. National parks and historical sites have become showcases for evolutionary information. Science magazines, geography and natural history publications, children's books, and TV specials present evolution to the public as fact. Many of today's most popular films, amusement parks, and even breakfast cereals promote evolutionary concepts to eager audiences. Textbooks that develop evolutionary theories are compulsory reading for public high school, college, and university students. Evolution has become the foundation for most scientific disciplines, including paleontology, geology, biology, and astronomy. The aim of many scientists is to eliminate supernatural explanations and provide naturalistic answers. Consequently, many must reject God's supernatural intervention in a miraculous creation. Carol Matriciana, born and raised in India, is author of Gods of the New Age and co-author of the book The Evolution Conspiracy, A Quantum Leap into the New Age.
While there are some scientists who believe in a creator God, most believe in physical evolution. That is, life forms becoming more complex with time. Many of these scientists would discount that there is any spiritual evolution going on. However, there are an increasing number, persuaded by one of today's popular worldviews known as the New Age movement, who are using the concepts of biological evolution to springboard into spiritual evolution.
Many prophesy a development, claiming that the next stage of man's evolution will be in spiritual terms. A quantum leap from biological evolution into a mystical emergence.
I think that man is evolving into a state of higher awareness, higher consciousness, higher vibration. And I think that the best representation that we have of man's movement in that direction is what's going on in the consciousness movement, New Age movement.
Evolution is going on all the time. Many people believe, and I believe, that the purpose of life is to grow, and that you grow as much as you can in each lifetime. And of course, we believe in reincarnation.
The parallel ideas of reincarnation and evolution have always been closely linked to the occultic beliefs of many of the world's pagan religions. But during the mid-19th century, this philosophy was suddenly given scientific respectability worldwide by an Englishman, Charles Darwin, who has become known as the father of evolution. The majority opinion of the day held to the biblical account of a creator God who intentionally designed each basic form of plant and animal. Although raised a Christian, Darwin rebelled against this idea and in his theory saw a way to formulate a process without a creator.
This is the home of Charles Darwin between 1842 and 1882. It's in this study that Charles Darwin produced his great works. In fact, he used to sit in this chair. It's here he wrote his famous On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. Charles Darwin is a giant among men in modern world because he developed the theory of evolution, which transformed the scientific world.
The theory of evolution by natural descent was in vogue long before Darwin's time. What Darwin did was provide a rational explanation of how it might have operated. So rational indeed that many people said, why didn't I think of that?
Many people felt most comfortable. As far as Darwin was concerned, he was their hero. He provided the explanation that they were seeking.
Modern science was born in 1620 when Lord Bacon wrote Novum Organum. Between 1620 and 1860, most scientists believed in the Creator and in the creation of man. Today, few scientists believe in creation or a Creator. What happened? Who were some of the molders of the modern mind? Standing here by Thomas Huxley in the Museum of Natural History. He's been called Darwin's bulldog because he took the theory of Darwin and gave a forceful presentation of it. Huxley believed that you could explain everything in nature apart from the Creator by pure natural laws.
We have to remember that after all, creationism was what everybody thought not all that many years ago. And creationism was overthrown in the scientific community by evolutionary thinking.
For the most part, Darwin's book was considered blasphemous by the average person in England at that time.
Karl Marx, an atheist and the originator of communism, was delighted to find a scientific rationale in the theory of evolution, which he claimed gave validation to his new philosophy. Marx admired Darwin, and the two communicated and corresponded. In appreciation, Marx even attempted to dedicate his greatest atheistic work, Das Kapital, to Darwin.
There were communists of the day, and Karl Marx was one of these, who saw Darwin's theory as giving scientific credibility to what was previously merely a philosophy. The philosophy of socialism, the philosophy of communism, it all became scientific and credible with Darwin's theory.
Roger Oakland is a former evolutionist and biology instructor and is co-author of the book The Evolution Conspiracy, A Quantum Leap into the New Age.
When the communists took over Yuanling province of China, the entire population was forced to attend propaganda classes. First lesson was not some words of wisdom from Lenin or Stalin, but a fundamental course in Darwinian evolution.
One of my former graduate students turned to communism. He was brought to Moscow for training. What do you think they taught him? Lenin, Marx? No. For 2 years they sat him in a library and taught him nothing but evolution, identifying it as the foundation of communism.
Without evolutionism, there can be no Marxism, no Leninism, no secular humanism, unless the universe created itself, unless man is God, unless there is no creator. None of these philosophies will stand.
The people who have devised the concept of evolution, starting with Charles Darwin himself, and even before him, have come up with a concept that starts with a vacuum. And then there was an explosion in that vacuum called the Big Bang that created the Milky Way galaxy with up to 200 billion stars, all circulating in intricate precision. The result of that explosion, and it gets all the way up to man without God getting into the act anywhere along the line. That is really the way it is taught in all of our public schools today. Darwin's whole purpose was to explain all of life without design and purpose, without the need for a creator, by purely mechanistic or natural processes.
Luther Sunderland, former aerospace engineer and author of the book Darwin's Enigma.
Now, what is this materialistic or natural explanation for evolution? It says that on the early Earth, in a soupy ocean, some chemicals got together and formed spontaneously the first living cell. Now, that was no minor operation, because the simplest single-celled organism we know anything about has in its genes and chromosomes about as much data as there are letters in the world's largest library, 1 trillion letters. No way in the world could random processes have organized that much data.
Most life forms are comprised of billions of these complex cells, which once again display themselves in perfect order. The mathematical impossibility of the human body being formed accidentally surpasses the logic of an explosion in a printing shop, resulting in the formation of a dictionary.
We are told that life began in this prebiotic soup, which was rich in all sorts of various compounds. But recent studies in the most ancient rocks show that there's no evidence that such a soup ever existed.
The scientific method is supposed to be based on the ability to observe and test things. And yet, evolutionists accept that non-living matter somehow became life. No one saw it happen. There's no examples of it happening today, and yet they claim it as a fact. In addition, no one has ever observed one form of life evolving into another form. But evolutionists are convinced that if you give it billions of years of time, these things can happen. You see, long periods of time become the magic factor.
Suppose someone walks into a science classroom at a university and claims that it's possible for a worm to become a man in just a few seconds of time. He's laughed out of the building. Someone else makes a claim that a worm can become a man given millions of years of time, and everyone there agrees. You see, by simply expanding the amount of time, a ridiculous idea seems credible. And that's the key to evolution.
As little as 120 years ago, the public at large generally accepted that the Earth was relatively young. One possibility indicated 6,000 to 10,000 years, based on biblical genealogies. Today, however, evolutionists have invented complex timetables spanning billions of years, specifically designed to allow vast amounts of time for various life forms to change into other life forms.
No one knows precisely how old the Earth is, but no matter how much time one gives an evolutionist, it still doesn't solve their dilemma as to how exactly life came into being in the first place.
Dr. John Morris, Associate Professor of Geology at the Institute for Creation Research in California.
There are hundreds of different clocks by which we can estimate the age of a rock or the age of the Earth, and almost all of them seem to give young ages for all of these things. There are about 5 or 6, however, that seem to give old ages. It's interesting that my evolutionary colleagues will always choose those old ones.
These dates are then substantiated through biased dating methods, such as radiometric dating. Although presented as objective and reliable, the results of radiometric dating are rejected if they do not agree with the preconceived evolutionary time frame.
When a scientist wants to date a rock, he sends it to a lab, but that lab won't even take that rock unless he sends in a form with it telling them exactly how old he thinks that rock is, and that gives them a target to shoot for. And on the machine, they would keep turning those knobs and keep working on it until they got that date. Many times when we read in the textbooks about a rock that's been dated so many billion years, we just assume that the people that have gathered those dates know what they're talking about. But that's not the case. I know how those dates are arrived at.
Until Darwin, many scientists were in agreement with the biblical account that animals produce after their own kind. But as the evolutionary perspective was given more authority, scientists were under pressure to prove Darwin's hypothesis and explain how life forms could possibly have changed from one form into another.
Now we're told that the way evolution proceeds is damages due to some outside influence like cosmic rays cause the cell to make mistakes. We call those mutations. And gradually one organism is supposed to have changed into another organism all the way from a single cell to invertebrates like clams or starfish, and then the vertebrate fishes, the amphibia, the reptiles, birds, mammals, and finally man. And here we are now, the product of billions of mistakes.
Scientists know the genetic code prevents one life form from changing into another kind. So they speculate that mutations or damages to the DNA must be responsible for evolutionary processes. Again, they believe this in spite of the observable evidence that no new species has ever resulted from a mutation.
Mutations are almost always harmful. They can bring about small adjustments in a particular species, but no way are they able to change one kind of creature into another.
If evolution has really occurred, we ought to be able to see the evidence in the fossil record. After all, that's the record of the past. But if we look at that fossil record carefully, we see that there are no recorded instances of one type of an animal ever changing into another. There's no transitional forms.
One of my advisors is working in the field of paleontology and has been working on the distribution of fossils in the record, and has found that there are no interspecific transitional forms, something that, of course, the creation model would have predicted and did predict long before this research was done.
We ought to see cats, and we ought to see dogs, and we ought to see cogs and dats. We ought to see them in between. We ought not to be able to divide them like we are now. But that doesn't usually stop my evolutionary colleagues. They will make the statements over and over again that the fossil record is replete with these transitional forms.
there are myriad transitional forms. There's really no problem finding transitional forms.
It's completely false to say that there's a lacking of transitional forms. We have plenty of them, more than sometimes we can cope with.
In fact, there are so many transitional forms between species that we must often fall back on statistical analysis to separate one from the other.
So the claim that there are no intermediates is simply a false claim.
During their interviews, several of these prominent scientists contradicted themselves, admitting that no transitional forms had been found, and proceeded to offer excuses for the lack of evidence.
The problem of transitional forms is one that all honest paleontologists have a problem with. The geologic record is incomplete. It's incomplete because of erosion that has eroded things away.
One of the things that also makes it a little more difficult in the fossil record is the rapidity with which evolution acts in very short bursts. It doesn't leave many transitional forms behind.
Let's go to the British Museum of Natural History, to the man who wrote the book there on evolution, Dr. Colin Patterson. I wrote to Dr. Patterson and asked him why he didn't put a single picture of an intermediate form or a connecting link in his book on evolution. Dr. Patterson now, who has 7 million fossils in his museum, said the following when he answered my letter, quote, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I certainly would have included them," unquote. Later he said, "I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one might make a watertight argument."
Since Darwin's time, evolutionists have aggressively searched for vital fossil evidence to support the idea that life forms evolved. Even Darwin admitted that his own theory was worthless speculation without invaluable fossil proof for transitional forms. In collaboration with evolutionists, oil companies have drilled wells throughout the world, examining layers of the earth to depths in excess of 5 miles. Of the millions of fossils unearthed, not one sample of a transitional form has been discovered. Over the years, the research of geology and archaeology have also failed to produce evidence that supports evolution's claims.
In Darwin's time, there was not a single example of anything that has come to be known as a missing link. In fact, it was not until almost the time of his death that a fossil bird was discovered in Bavaria, I believe. It was named Archaeopteryx. That was, for all intents and purposes, intermediate between reptiles and birds. That was a triumph of his hypothesis.
Archaeopteryx, classified today by many paleontologists as a true bird, not a reptile-bird intermediary, was the first of a number of deceptive schemes promoting evolutionary ideas. Evolutionists misdated and misidentified this extinct bird, presuming it to be the missing link between reptiles and birds.
The best example of a transitional form that my evolutionary friends usually give is Archaeopteryx, a supposed link between the reptiles and the birds. Recently, another bird has been found, dated by evolutionists, to be 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. So therefore, Archaeopteryx could certainly not be the ancestor of the birds. Actually, evolutionists don't have any idea how the reptiles evolved into birds. They don't have any of these transitional forms. But that doesn't stop them. You pick up any book on evolution, and Archaeopteryx is still presented as the best evidence.
Archaeopteryx here is a good example of a transitional form because it shares characters which we ordinarily think of being typical either of birds or dinosaurs. Archaeopteryx is right halfway between, and it's for this reason that many of us are inclined to call birds reptiles. The next time you have a Thanksgiving dinner, you can tell people that you're eating dinosaurs.
Reptiles are supposed to have converted their scales into feathers. Now, a scale in a reptile is nothing but a fold in the skin. Now, how in the world could a fold in the skin have ever been frayed out into the intricate design of a feather? There's never been anything found intermediate between the fold in the reptile skin and the feather of a bird.
In the evolution of flying creatures, an animal's forelimb, good for walking or climbing, must have gradually changed into a wing. We have never found any fossils that showed this in-between structure. I suspect that such a creature, long before he had a good wing, had a lousy forelimb, and he could neither have walked nor flown. The whole idea is ludicrous.
Because no fossil records exist to confirm evolutionary assumptions, dubious artworks are relied upon and exhibited as fact. Misleading artistic interpretations depict fish magically growing legs and changing into amphibians, extinct deer-like creatures mysteriously turning into horses, and monkeys becoming humans. Where non-existent transitional skeletons are needed to prove a point, skilled craftsmen substitute plastic and wooden models.
I'm very concerned about the way our museums present evolution as though it were a proven fact. And actually, false information is being presented. You see, since the museums don't have the transitional forms, they have to make them up out of thin air.
The November 1980 edition of Science Digest shows a drawing of a whale with legs as an evolutionary link between whales and cows. But the only fossil evidence for this mythological transition is a skull and several teeth, no leg bones.
Niles Eldridge at the American Museum said, "You're only limited by the credulity of your audience and your own imagination in making up these stories of what changed into what and what the intermediate forms were."
When asked to come up with evidence that evolution really has taken place, evolutionists will frequently bring up very minor changes in living things, such as insects becoming resistant to DDT or insects changing color.
Can we see evolution taking place today? You certainly can. We can. One of the most spectacular examples, have you ever heard of the San Jose scale? San Jose scale is an insect that infects oranges. The thing has evolved to resist the pesticides that they were using on it.
One can see in historical times examples of evolutionary change. For example, if one looks at attempts to eradicate particular pests with different kinds of insecticides, it turns out that within a normal population of a particular kind of insect, for example, there are some that are resistant to a particular kind of insecticide.
This is not evolution. Evolutionists should know better. These small changes are totally compatible with the creation understanding of things. What we need to see is major changes, some type of an animal changing into another type of an animal, and this we do not see.
If we're talking about seeing evolution today, seeing one species changing into another species, that's not going to happen. Although there must be, from an evolutionary perspective, many transitional forms out there, the likelihood of finding any one of them is extremely low.
The more we learn about paleontology, that is fossils, the more certain we are that evolution is based on faith alone.
The National Academy of Science is the official advisor to the U.S. government on questions of science. In its publications, it falsely claims that the missing links that troubled Darwin are no longer missing. This is misrepresentation which deceives millions, because after 120 years of exhaustive searching, Darwin's missing links are still missing. Yet this academy and evolutionists continue to perpetuate the mythical theory that man developed from ape-like creatures.
Richard Leakey, who is one of the most well-known anthropologists, said that if he were asked to draw a family tree for man, he would just have to draw a huge question mark, because the evidence is too scanty to possibly know man's evolutionary origin, and he didn't think we're ever going to find it.
To aid and abet evolutionary concepts, artistic depictions have gone beyond ethical boundaries. Despite having no foundation for the ape-to-man theory, scientists and artists continue to dupe the public with lifelike but imaginary illustrations. These artists vainly entertain natural progressions of apes to humans and presume their hair color, skin tones, and even facial expressions from no more than a tooth, a piece of bone, or even no evidence at all. National Geographic magazine, which doesn't attempt to hide its evolutionary bias, admits that these fossilized footprints are identical to human footprints. Yet artists take the liberty to accommodate evolutionary theory and illustrate ape-like features to fit ape-like creatures. All because biased dating processes insist that these footprints were found in rock layers said to exist before humans.
Now, today we have evolutionists who would like us to believe there is solid evidence for evolution. Before the public, they generally create the impression that the evidence is just like solid gold, that man has evolved from some ape-like creature.
Dr. Donald Johanson, director of the Institute of Human Origins, discovered Lucy, an alleged ape-to-man missing link.
The human family and the ape family diverged and went on their own individual and separate evolutionary trajectories. We don't know precisely what the common ancestor was for that, but we know that it resembles something like what is called Ramapithecus.
Ramapithecus. That was formed out of nothing but a fragment of a jaw and several teeth. And for many, many years, Ramapithecus was held up as our ape-like ancestor. But now Dr. Pilbeam at the Yale-Harvard Peabody Museum, when I interviewed him, he said, we have found about 40 of these creatures now, some of them fairly complete, and they are not on the direct line to becoming man at all. They're more like an orangutan.
Dr. Pilbeam of Yale, who first claimed that Ramapithecus was an ancestor of man, now suggests that it isn't. Yet evolutionists continue to cite Ramapithecus as an ape-man link.
Another so-called missing link, Java Man, was concocted by Eugene Dubois when he found an ape-like skull fragment, and then 50 feet away he found a human leg bone. However, just before he died, Dubois confessed that he'd also found 2 human skulls at this same location, and he admitted that the skull fragment belonged to a gibbon and not to an ape man.
Homo erectus is probably best known as Java Man. And it was at this stage in human evolution that they began to make and use these large triangular hand axes, brains expanded over 1,000 cc's, body proportions similar to ours evolved, and we were firmly on the road to later hominids, including modern humans.
This hoax is still accepted by evolutionists today, and it's presented to the public as a true missing link. If you think the Java Man hoax is incredible, wait until you hear all the facts surrounding Johanson's Lucy, this little 3.5-foot adult skeleton, which looks just like a chimpanzee.
As you know, Lucy was found in 1974, and sometimes I refer to her as the woman who shook up man's family tree, because she represents for us the oldest, most complete skeleton we have of any human ancestor known to anthropologists.
Now, the species Australopithecus afarensis, as represented by Lucy, is a species that we feel is ancestral to modern humans. And the significance of Lucy is that she gives us a good idea of what our ancestors looked like some 3 million years ago. We can learn from her skeleton about the way that she walked, for example. When we look at her knee joint, when we look at her pelvis, we see that she walked like you and I, instead of like a chimpanzee.
Johanson said, even though this is a very ape-like creature, it walked upright. Well, the pygmy chimp today wanders around in the rainforest walking upright almost all the time, so that doesn't prove anything.
Actually, the only features of Lucy which even hint at erect posture are the knee and hip joints. Dr. Charles Oxnard, with a sophisticated computer analysis, has concluded that Johansson's claims for the hip are unfounded, and it must be pointed out that the knee was not even found with Lucy.
This knee joint was found over a mile away, 200 feet deeper than the other bones.
She comes closer to representing, I think, what the average person thinks of as the missing link than any other fossil we had ever found in Africa. So she has extraordinary importance in terms of understanding the very earliest phases of human evolution.
Richard Leakey and others are now claiming that, in all likelihood, Lucy is really a mosaic of 2 or more species. This isn't funny. What is funny is that they claim that creation isn't scientific.
The next thing back was Piltdown Man. Here was a case where a human skull had been doctored up along with a jaw of an orangutan to make the jaw look somewhat human. The teeth were filed. It turned out to be a pure fraud. Piltdown Man was a purposeful fraud, and it fooled the world's greatest evolutionists simply because they so much wanted to believe that there was some evidence for evolution. Neanderthal man was originally found in the Neanderthal Valley of Germany. These creatures, almost all, looked very modern, but several of them, 2 or 3, had a very stooped-over, brutish appearance. Now, however, 2 scientists have gone over to the museums in Europe from Johns Hopkins University, got these bones out of the museums, and x-rayed the ones that had a very stooped-over appearance. And lo and behold, they discovered that the stooped-over creatures had rickets or some vitamin D deficiency disease, such as arthritis. They have reclassified the Neanderthals from a separate species, now put them back into Homo sapiens, the same as modern man. Now, Nebraska man consisted of nothing but a single tooth. And around this single tooth, pictures were drawn showing an ape-like creature that had evolved into man. It turned out later that this tooth was nothing but the tooth of an extinct pig. And this is a case now where a pig made a monkey out of an evolutionist. I think man has always been man. The scientific evidence shows this, and this, of course, is very consistent with the account of creation that is presented in the book of Genesis. Behind closed doors, or occasionally when speaking very candidly, the evolutionists admit there is really no evidence that man evolved from the apes.
The evolutionists realize that they can no longer rely on the fossil record to give them any support. So what they've done is they've come up with a very crafty alternative to the Darwinian concept of evolution. They call it the punctuated equilibria concept.
One of the really exciting developments in evolutionary theory in the last 10 to 15 years has been the theory that instead of evolving very gradually over a long period of time, that evolution came in short bursts that were interspersed with much longer periods where virtually nothing happened.
You see, this solves all kinds of problems intellectually for the evolutionist. He doesn't have to look at the fossil record.
There is no evidence in the fossil record that one type of animal ever changed into another type of animal. Punctuated equilibria comes along and says that isolated populations of animals evolved rapidly and left no fossil trace. But this is an argument from lack of data. There are no transitional forms, and that's used then as proof of the brand of evolution called punctuated equilibria. This is bad science.
With this new information, we're trying to refine our view of evolution. And what's emerging is a much more powerful synthesis of the evolutionary theories.
I'm convinced that the idea of punctuated equilibria is really a desperate attempt to salvage evolutionary theory.
Punctuated equilibrium, while attempting to explain the lack of intermediate forms between neighboring species, neglects to address the real issue that asks why there are no transitions between major categories of life forms. One extraordinary answer was offered by Goldschmidt's hopeful monster theory.
Who would believe, for instance, that a reptile laid an egg and a bird came crawling out of the egg, as Goldschmidt had said about this theory when he first came up with it?
We are literally going back to the very foundations of evolutionary principles and reevaluating once again the mechanisms whereby evolution takes place. Unfortunately, I think a number of those outside the scientific fields that deal with evolution interpret this as a casting doubt on the very what I would call the fact of evolution.
What it does say to us is that the evolutionists are running scared.
It seems like almost every new development in science is converging to destroy evolution. Whether we're talking about new discoveries in astronomy or in paleontology or biology, this is true.
I suddenly realized that there was very little evidence for the theory of evolution, and yet I had just accepted it as truth from a very young age.
I just realized, finally, after studying all this material and thinking this thing through, that the evidence, the scientific evidence for creation, is a lot stronger than the scientific evidence for evolution.
In the last decade, most of the basic pillars upon which evolution has stood have collapsed, and the theory is in chaos. Now, unfortunately, at this time, the evolutionists are crying louder than ever before that evolution is a fact.
Well, it's my personal view that evolution is a dead certain fact.
Evolution. There is no question that it happened.
The geological record cannot be explained in any other way than through the evolutionary process.
Many times you'll hear the statement that evolution is a fact, but a scientist should know better than to make a statement like that. If evolution has ever occurred, it was not observed, and therefore it's outside the realm of science. It's inaccessible to scientists and the scientific method. Many of my evolutionary colleagues are coming up with rather bizarre theories. It seems that they recognize that evolution doesn't make good sense scientifically, and so they're forced to come up with these incredible imaginary ideas.
The Evolution Conspiracy.
Some now recognize that the spontaneous generation of life from non-life is scientifically impossible. So what do? Do they attribute it to a creator? No, they claim that life came from outer space. Well, they can believe that if they want to, but they shouldn't call it science, and they shouldn't teach it in schools as if it were science.
Evolution is simply a matter of making up stories in place of the actual scientific data.
Science used to be the search for truth. Now it seems it's deteriorated into the search for a believable story.
The scientist who can make up the most plausible sounding story and can get it printed or get the media to tell about it, he's the one that becomes famous. I can say that as a scientist I see zero evidence that evolution has occurred or that any is going on today.
One scientist I spoke with said that even if evolution is not true, there's no way it could ever be retracted because it had gone too far. Millions of textbooks would have to be reprinted, and museums all over the world would have to tear down their exhibits. Society would never trust science again.
In July of 1925, the trial of the century took place in Dayton, Tennessee. For the first time in educational history in this land, the concept of a creator was totally challenged. This was the great turning point. Up till 1925, all of your science classes taught creation. Today, all that you have taught in the science classroom is evolutionism.
John Scopes, a schoolteacher, was found guilty of violating Tennessee law, which prohibited the teaching of human evolution. Less than 10 years later, by 1933, the Humanist Manifesto was signed by a small but powerful group of people presenting themselves as a non-profit religion. Their religion was humanism, and it swept through the educational system through the zealous pursuits of John Dewey, a socialist and first president of the American Humanist Association. Today, public schools are the seminaries for Dewey's religion of humanism, and its doctrine of evolution dominates the educational system.
Now, today we do have religion being taught in our public schools. The fundamental tenet of humanism, for instance, as listed right in the Humanist Manifesto. Tenet number 1, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing. It was not created. Tenet number 2, man is the product of a long natural process, that is, evolution.
A very few people originally got control of our education system in this land. One of the things that was imperative for them to push through their programs was evolutionism.
Most people do not believe that evolution happened. The fact that most scientists do, or practically all scientists do, is in a sense neither here nor there, because in fact we would like the ideas to get across to our students.
The thing that the average Christian in America has never realized is that his tax dollars pay the school teacher's salary, they pay for the textbooks, and yet most parents still will not say one word about anything that happens in that classroom that disturbs them. For parents to allow a godless indoctrination in evolutionism is just unthinkable.
Thousands of children are bused daily to our museums as part of school-sponsored field trips, where they're given crash courses in evolution. And just like in the Soviet Union, this religion of atheism is presented as fact, with no alternate viewpoints allowed to be expressed.
Attorney Wendell Bird argued the case for balanced treatment of creation science and evolution before the U.S. Supreme Court. He is author of the book, The Origin of Species Revisited.
To me, the basic issue is academic freedom, because no one's trying to exclude evolution from public schools while teaching a theory of creation. Instead, the evolutionists are trying to exclude alternatives, while, in general, defending the exclusive teaching of evolution.
Well, I think creationism should be taught in schools simply because all good ideas should be taught in schools. I think we shouldn't be afraid of ideas, whether we oppose them or whether we're for them. I think we should expose everyone to both sides of the issue.
86% of the American public believes that the theory of evolution ought to be taught along with the scientific theory of creation, according to an AP NBC News nationwide poll.
I think creation should be taught in schools because it's a part of what we are, and I think it should be taught with an open mind without religious intonations.
Lawyers nationwide, more than 2 to 1, agree that it is constitutional to teach the theory of creation along with the theory of evolution. And lawyers better than 2 to 1 believe that both should be taught in public schools.
Yes, creation should be taught in schools. Equal time should be given to evolution and creation.
42.3% of biology teachers believe in teaching a theory of creation along with the theory of evolution. And the same is true of school board members, 2/3, according to a poll by the American School Board Journal. The fact is that contrary to all of the smoke, the great majority of the American public feels that it is unfair to teach just the theory of evolution.
No more than 6% have ever wanted only evolutionism taught, but there is such total domination and control in the scientific community that we still are placating the 6% of the people in this land who believe there is no God and believe that the universe created itself.
Well, since there's no one answer and you can't prove the past yet, then both ideas should be taught.
The only fair approach is to let the children hear all of the scientific information and make up their own minds.
Should other concepts of how life got started be taught in the public schools? I don't think creationism should, because creationism is a thinly disguised religious doctrine, which has got no place in the separation of church and state.
The main issue that is always raised in opposition to teaching all the scientific evidence on the subject of origins is that it violates separation of church and state to teach evidence that doesn't happen to support evolution.
People should simply be able to hear the truth. A fact is a fact. You don't throw it out just because it happens to agree with the Bible. That doesn't make it religious.
Teaching a theory of creation is constitutional because the Constitution was written in the context of the Declaration of Independence, which refers to creation and even to a creator.
In response to public outcry for the presentation of creation science alongside evolution, Louisiana and Arkansas were the first states to pass laws mandating balanced treatment for both theories. It was agreed that only scientific data minus religious doctrines be presented in the classrooms.
The Louisiana legislature in 1981 passed a law for, quote, balanced treatment of creation science and evolution. The law also defined what evolution is, quote, scientific evidence supporting evolution. It defined what creation science is, quote, scientific evidence supporting creation.
Immediately, aggressive litigation was put into action by a powerful organization which is firmly directed against traditional Judeo-Christian principles. The influential ACLU, or American Civil Liberties Union, equipped with over 500 active attorneys, invested huge amounts of money and successfully protested the law.
One of the biggest problems you have with the ACLU is that they're so well funded. They get millions and millions of dollars from large foundations and from wealthy people all across America. That's what they did to us. They tied us up in court in Louisiana.
We filed a slim brief of 630 pages with 2,000 footnotes, arguing that creation science is constitutional to teach, scientific in content, and as non-religious as evolution. The U.S. District Court judge entered a summary judgment against us nonetheless, saying that creation science involves the concept of creation, which implies a creator which is inherently religious.
The ACLU was able to convince the Supreme Court that creation science was basically religious. The court violated the Constitution by redefining the First Amendment author's intention, which is against favoring any one religion above another. In their decision, the Supreme Court favored naturalistic evolution, a belief of religious humanists. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence supporting creation science, the court ruled that creationism should not be given mandatory status in public schools, but could be taught alongside evolution at the teacher's discretion. Irresponsible and slanted journalism labeled the case as religion versus science, and falsely reported that creation science had been banned from the classroom.
The U.S. Supreme Court did not say that any teaching of a theory of creation is unconstitutional. It specifically reaffirmed the right of teachers to teach all the scientific evidence on the subject of origins.
The scientific community is very seriously worried about the growth of creationism as an attack on the validity and the autonomy of science, and particularly in the insistence that creationism be taught in the public schools in science courses.
There's a very strong network and general feeling that creation, theories of creation, maybe theories of abrupt appearance, are a menace to science. Let me mention several organizations that actively today try to prevent it from being taught in public schools. Committees of Correspondence, People for the American Way, the American Humanist Association, the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Education Association, the National Association of Biology Teachers, and the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study.
If there is one anti-scientific theory today that most threatens the whole nature of scientific inquiry, it is creationism.
Today we really have an organized conspiracy in this country, in every state, that is organized to fight the open hearing of scientific evidences on origins.
The result was the forming of a loose network of active organizations that will cooperate to combat the creationist intrusion into the public schools, public museums, national and state parks, and the governmental funding of science research. They have a very specific desire to preserve the exclusive teaching of evolution and to exclude any teaching of a scientific theory of creation or a scientific theory of abrupt appearance. That's censorship, in my view.
We have today what is unquestionably the worst case of censorship. Good scientific data that happens to make it look bad for evolution, but that is meticulously censored from the textbooks.
In an American society where we have always taken great pride in freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, freedom of press, it's just so unfortunate that we have such great censorship in our scientific community today.
Evolutionists will not acknowledge the scientific data supporting creation. They believe the creationists' only intention in presenting such facts is to push their religious bias. By successfully blurring the issues, evolutionists have falsely established evolution as scientific fact and strongly concealed its own religious affiliation.
Most world religions, except Judeo-Christianity, are formed on the myth of biological evolution. One prominent world religion today gaining much popularity through celebrities like Shirley MacLaine is known as the New Age movement or the New Consciousness movement. At its heart is reincarnation and karma, both part of evolution which is based in Eastern mysticism.
The New Age movement is asking us to recognize our oneness by accepting the idea that we all evolved from the same pond. And if we can unite our minds and spirits using techniques such as meditation and channeling, we can supposedly get incredible powers, achieve global unity.
New Age is an interrelated network of various philosophies and political causes. Its goal is to promote an awareness of global oneness, physically and mystically.
Everybody from Jesus Christ to Adolf Hitler would be seen as someone who we can identify with because we are all one,
I think that certainly there is every potential for all of us as spiritual beings to merge as one.
We've mastered the evolution of the physical body. We've mastered the evolution of the mind, or we're moving in that direction. So we're coming to a time where we're using this perfected, quasi-perfected body, this opening and perfecting mind, to access the true perfection of the universe, which is the spiritual dimension.
According to New Agers, the next phase of mankind's evolution is elevation to godhood. They see the human race as a transitional form between apes and God.
That's, I think, our purpose on earth, and I think we're understanding that, is to make ourselves whole, to become one with ourselves, and then to realize our godhood.
I believe that everyone has Christ consciousness within themselves, and all they need to do is go inside and realize that and bring it forward and be that Christ consciousness.
Evolution, whether biological or mystical, is man's way to explain away God and his creation and put man in God's place.
Man has basically got the biological future of the earth in his hands. He can control evolution.
We're in a time now where man is literally taking control of his own evolution, taking control of where mankind goes, both individually and collectively.
I believe that the New Age movement is heading into the mainstream of American consciousness, and I think that it's going to get there by exposure in the mass media. The ideas, the concepts, the principles, the psychology, the spirituality. I think that this is a movement that will go all the way around the earth and ultimately serve as a vehicle to transform levels of consciousness that will allow us to live in a more natural, harmonious way with the elements and with the universe.
This mushrooming philosophy should be a burning concern for Christians to try and understand so that they can become effective Christian witnesses. Not only is God's character at stake here, but his truth and morality.
The desire for godhood, which is the goal of the New Age consciousness movement, is the same thing that brought about the fall of man. In being our own gods, we can justify our behavior and are accountable to no one.
In the Bible, Romans chapter 1 warns us about the natural consequences of rejecting God, the Creator. It results in man becoming involved in wickedness and moral corruption.
As a result of the work of evolution, unbelief and skepticism are rampant in our society, and the moral and ethical effects have been devastating.
If there is a moral governor in the universe, then each person in this universe is responsible to that moral governor. The easiest thing in man's mind to do is just to dismiss the possibility of that moral governorship.
Adolf Hitler used the Darwinian thesis of natural selection, the survival of the fittest, to weed out who he considered to be the inferior strand of humanity. He brutally tortured and killed 12 million people, 6 million Jews and 6 million non-Jews. In effect, we are doing the same thing today with abortion, euthanasia, and infanticide, weeding out those whom we consider to be unwanted persons. Since 1973 in the USA alone, nearly 25 million unborn human beings were killed by abortion. That is one baby every 20 seconds. If we deny that man is created in the image and likeness of God, then we lose the dignity and purpose of life. If we agree with the evolutionary premise that we are no more than evolved animals, then humankind loses all moral perspectives.
People don't want to take responsibility for their actions. They don't want God looking over their shoulder. Evolution is nothing more than an elaborate path one takes to run away from God. I stopped running and gave my heart to Jesus Christ, and all the scientific facts I'd been struggling with fell into place.
We can either choose to look to evolution for the answers, or we can choose to consider an alternative. Just look at the vastness of the universe with its galaxies, solar systems, the planets, all circulating in perfect precision. There are more stars than grains of sand in all the world. Just think of the complexity of life, the intricacies of the eye, the ear, the heart, or the human brain. Is it logical to assume it all happened by random chance? Or was there an awesome creator and designer behind it all? The Bible says that man is without excuse because all around him he can see through the evidence of nature the mighty workings of a creator God.
When Spiritist prophet Andrew Jackson Davis channeled his book on the principles of nature, he claimed to be a voice to mankind, to set forth the divine revelations of nature itself. He declared that in the beginning, the universalum was one boundless, undefinable, and unimaginable ocean of liquid fire, and that through an evolving process, all things proceeded from this principle of power. Like Mary Baker Eddy, Davis taught that God was not a person who created things according to his will, but rather was a principle or force that could be tapped into. Describing the laws of man and nature, he said, "Would it not be best to have the world exist on these immutable laws? Then existence would be emblematical of the brightness and beauty of Eden. Then the great tree which has so long been concealed from the mental view would grow and progress in glory, beauty, and perfection. Its branches would wave over the world. Such would be the delicious fruits of the great tree of knowledge." Rather than recognize the tree of knowledge as a curse upon mankind, Davis sought to embrace it. And rather than allow God's word to define how we understand nature, Davis suggested that man's understanding of nature should govern his comprehension of God. Davis wrote, "It is the office of paleontological sciences to set forth general truths in the departments of astronomy, geology, anatomy, physiology, etc., all as in perfect harmony with each other. In this, true theology has its foundation, and the teachings of this should constitute the only study of the theologian. As such, it is compelling that men of science would become the oracles for the next stage in the new thought process." In 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species. Most students today, while familiar with Darwin, are unaware of the full title of his work, which is The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. In this work, Darwin challenged the origin of animal life on the planet and formalized the evolutionary ideas that had been pondered for centuries. In 1871, Darwin published The Descent of Man, in which he applied this thinking to the origin of mankind itself. More than a century later, Charles Darwin is revered as a prophetic voice for humanism in the scientific community. His theories on evolution are today regarded as scientific fact. The very authorship of life itself, once acknowledged as from a divine creator who made man in his own image, has now been attributed to chance and the coincidence of nature. Yet some researchers argue that Darwin's theory has no foundation in real science, but is rather based on the ancient mystery teachings of the occult.
First, I would say the evolution theory did not start with Charles Darwin. It started way before that. It actually started in the Garden of Eden with Satan, when he said to Eve in Genesis chapter 3, "Eve, if you eat off that tree, ye shall be as gods." The whole idea that man can progress and evolve and become better, is an idea that came from the devil in the Garden of Eden. Satan started that. And then down through history, there have been who knows how many thousands of folks that have promoted that idea or pushed it. Aristotle taught a form of evolution. Plato taught a type of evolution. The Babylonians, I mean, down through history, there's always been folks who taught, you know, that the Egyptians taught we evolved from slime along the Nile River. So Darwin simply made the theory popular. That's all he did. He didn't really invent the theory of evolution. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, wrote a whole book called Zoonomia, where he basically laid out everything Darwin said. And Darwin, his grandson, then stole all of his ideas and never gave credit to Grandpa one time. Interesting plagiarism back then. But Darwin's theory, as we call it Darwin's theory, but actually it was way before him. The evolution theory would say that everything is evolving and getting better, and we don't see any of that. You know, we don't see any mutations produce any improvement to the gene pool. Mutation is a scrambling of information that results in a genetic loss. Nobody's ever proven a good mutation. Some people say, well, bacteria become resistant to drugs. I say, well, yeah, that's because they lost information. The antibiotic can't lock onto the ribosome. So it's like somebody's coming through town and they're handcuffing everybody, hauling them off to jail, going to kill them. But you don't have any arms, so they can't handcuff you. You say, wow, that's beneficial. Well, it might be beneficial for the moment, but it's not beneficial in the long term, okay? So these bacteria that are deformed, that have lost information, now are able to be resistant to the drugs only for that particular drug, and only for a short time. When you put them back in the regular population, they're worse off. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever to back up the evolution theory. Nobody's ever seen a dog come from a non-dog, and we certainly have never seen a dog come from a rock, which is what the evolution theory teaches if you go back, you know, millions of years. Most evolutionists don't even know their own theory. They don't even know that they believe they came from a rock 4.6 billion years ago.
A typical modern science textbook says that 18 to 20 billion years ago, all the matter in the universe was concentrated into one very dense, very hot region that may have been much smaller than a period on this page. For some unknown reason, this region exploded. This explosion is called the Big Bang. Coming out of this Big Bang, a giant rock somehow appeared that was rained on by cosmic rains from millions of years. Evolutionary scientists teach that from this rock supposedly came all the life on planet Earth.
So the evolution theory teaches, 20 billion years ago or sometime in the past, pick a number, nothing exploded and made everything. And then all this stuff was spreading out through space from the Big Bang theory, and then slowly groups of this matter began to get together and condense into planets and stars and moons and stuff like that. And then slowly, very slowly, over billions of years, or quickly if you're from Harvard, one of those planets, Earth, started to develop life, just by chance, of course, took a long time. And then that first life form that slowly evolved out of the soup in the ocean learned how to reproduce itself, which is a pretty good trick, of course. And then slowly it turned into different kinds of animals. So elephants and bananas and humans have a common ancestor by the evolution theory. That is pure speculation. It's religious. They believe that. I don't care what they believe, but it's not science.
Darwinian scientists have attempted to explain the process of evolution as a gradual development that takes place over millions of years. Yet some scientists argue that for the building blocks of life, this is simply impossible. Darwin himself admitted that if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Through the 20th century, the complexity of living organisms has revealed itself to be far greater than Darwin ever imagined. At the White House Millennium Council for the year 2000, world-renowned scientist Stephen Hawking commented that our present computers are less complex than the brain of an earthworm, a species not noted for their intellectual powers. Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling taught that a single cell, the smallest living unit, is more complicated than New York City. In his book, Darwin's Black Box, author and biochemist Michael J. Behe argues that the complexity of cell structure overthrows the idea of a gradual evolution. His conclusions reveal that highly sophisticated molecular machines control every cellular process. Thus, the details of life are finely calibrated, and the machinery of life enormously complex. Behe writes that the simplest self-sufficient cell has the capacity to produce thousands of different proteins and other molecules. Synthesis, degradation, energy generation, replication, maintenance of cell architecture, mobility, regulation, repair, communication, all of these functions take place in virtually every cell, and each function itself requires the interaction of numerous parts. A child can die because of a single defect in one of the many machines needed for taking proteins to the lysosome. A single flaw in the cell's protein transport pathway is fatal. Unless the entire system were immediately in place, our ancestors would have died. He concludes that attempts at a gradual evolution are a recipe for extinction. Behe further rebukes the scientific community for ignoring the evidence. He says the impotence of Darwinian theory in accounting for the molecular basis of life is evident from the complete absence in the professional scientific literature of any detailed models by which complex biochemical systems could have been produced. In the 20th century, other noteworthy scientists have agreed. World-renowned astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle rejected Darwin's theory. It was Hoyle who coined the phrase, the Big Bang. He was, in fact, mocking the idea that all things came about through some great explosion billions of years ago. Hoyle calculated that the odds of producing just the basic enzymes of life by chance are 1 in 1 with 40,000 zeros after it. Hoyle claims that believing the first cell originated by chance is like believing a tornado could sweep through a junkyard filled with airplane parts and form a Boeing 747. He said, the scientific world has been bamboozled into believing that evolution has been proved. Nothing could be further from the truth. Hoyle said this situation is well known to geneticists, and yet nobody seems to blow the whistle decisively on the theory. Most scientists still cling to Darwinism because of its grip on the educational system. You either have to believe the concepts or be branded a heretic. Australian biologist Michael Denton, author of the book Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, says science has so thoroughly discredited Darwinian evolution that it should be discarded. Meanwhile, mathematics professor Wolfgang Smith says evolution is a metaphysical myth, totally bereft of scientific sanction. At the British Museum of Natural History in London, paleontologist Colin Patterson started asking other scientists to tell him one thing they knew about evolution. Lecturing to biologists at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, he said, I tried that question on the geology staff at the Field Museum of Natural History, and the only answer I got was silence. I tried it on the members of the Evolutionary Morphology Seminar in the University of Chicago, a very prestigious body of evolutionists, and all I got there was silence for a long time, and eventually one person said, I do know one thing, it ought not to be taught in high school. In spite of the evidence, Patterson did not abandon evolution. He says, then I woke up and realized that all my life I had been duped into taking evolutionism as revealed truth in some way. He said he had experienced a shift from evolution as knowledge to evolution as faith. What Patterson described was his own paradigm shift from scientist to Darwinian worshiper. His idol, the cathedral of evolutionary thought. This trend among scientists has been acknowledged by others in the scientific community.
The building behind me is London's Natural History Museum. It looks rather like a cathedral or a church, and in a way that's what it is. It's a kind of temple to Darwin's theory of evolution. People come to museums like the Natural History Museum to get answers to their question, have we evolved from apes? Do humans and apes share a common ancestor? And to look at an exhibit like this, you'd think that question had been answered decisively yes. But the answer is far from decisive. In fact, this representation is an interpretation of the fossils, the interpretation of one group of scientists. There are other interpretations, but you won't find them in this museum or any other museum in the world.
In the days of early America, the Founding Fathers held few doubts that man had been created rather than evolved. The Declaration of Independence says plainly, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." The Founding Fathers maintained that the rights and liberties of men were defended by the authority of God, who created them. But if mankind merely evolved, then a man's rights are established only by man's opinion. As that opinion changes, the rights of men can also change, as was the case in Nazi Germany.
Hitler believed that evolution was true and the inferior races need to be eliminated, and he had a list.
Hitler's opinion was that Jews and people considered genetically inferior should be eliminated from society. The Nazis relied upon the Darwinian view of the natural selection of favored races to further their own ideas on the struggle for life. In fact, Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, means my struggle, a struggle the Nazis clearly defined as demonstrated by this propaganda film. In the opening scene, the narrator makes direct reference to Darwin's teaching on natural selection.
Alles Lebensschwache geht in der Natur unfehlbar zugrunde. Wir Menschen haben gegen dieses Gesetz der natürlichen Auslese in den letzten Jahrzehnten furchtbar gesündigt. Wir haben unwertes Leben nicht nur erhalten, wir haben ihm auch Vermehrung gewährt. Die Nachkommen dieser Kranken sahen so aus. Erbgesunde Menschen wohnten in engen, lichtlosen Gassen und halb verfallenen Lauben. Idioten und Schwachsinnigen baute man aber Paläste, und diese kranken Menschen waren gar nicht empfänglich für die Schönheit, mit der man sie umgab. Das deutsche Volk kennt das ganze Ausmaß dieses Elends wohl kaum. Es kennt nicht den drückenden Geist jener Häuser, in denen Tausende lallende Schwachsinnige künstlich ernährt und gepflegt werden müssen, die tiefer stehen als jedes Tier. In den letzten 70 Jahren hat sich unser Volk um 50% vermehrt, während die Zahl der Erbkranken im gleichen Zeitraum um 450% gestiegen ist. Wenn diese Entwicklung so weiterliefe, würde schon in 50 Jahren auf 4 gesunde Menschen ein Erbkranker kommen. Ein endloser Zug des Grauens würde in die Nation hineinmarschieren. Maßloses Elend über ein wertvolles Volk kommen, das dann mit Riesenschritten seinem Ende entgegenginge.
Die jüdische Bevölkerung Baltis wird in Sammellager gebracht. Das sind jene Ostjudentypen, die besonders nach dem Weltkriege die Großstädte Mittel- und Westeuropas überschwemmten, wo sie als Parasiten ihre Gastvölker zersetzten und tausendjährige Kulturen zu vernichten drohten.
Under evolutionary influence, Hitler declared, "I have the right to exterminate millions of individuals of inferior races which multiply like vermin." While Germany had been a democratic society, the Nazis evolved German law and changed it to suit their own wicked desires. In the Bible, God says, "I am the Lord, I change not." Jesus said, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away." It is for this reason that the principles and teachings of the Bible were considered so important by early Americans. Sir William Blackstone maintained that man-made laws should not be allowed to contradict the laws of God. And if man's laws did contradict God's laws, Blackstone stated they were not valid. In Acts 5:29, the apostles taught, we ought to obey God rather than men. In the Bible, God reveals that because man was made in God's image, he holds a particular place above every creature on earth. Man is not equal to the beasts of the field, but he would be if all life evolved from a common source. If that were the case, killing a man would be no different than killing an insect, or a cow, or a carrot. This was the thinking that allowed Hitler to murder millions in the Second World War. Exterminating Jews and undesirables was compared to getting rid of rats and insects.
Ratten auch auftauchen, tragen sie Vernichtung ins Land, zerstören sie menschliche Güter und Nahrungsmittel. Auf diese Weise verbreiten sie Krankheiten, Pest, Lepra, Typhus, Cholera, Ruhr und so weiter. Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen.
This Nazi documentary shows workers using poison gas as a pesticide.
Blausäure, die ja äußerst giftig ist, eignet sich zur Schädlingsbekämpfung ganz besonders. Hier ihre einfachste Anwendungsart. Man lässt sie von porösen Gipswürfeln aufsaugen, die dann in gewöhnlichen Blechbüchsen gasdicht verschlossen werden.
Within a few years, this same gas would be used to murder Jews at Auschwitz. Heinrich Himmler stated that anti-Semitism is like being deloused. Getting rid of lice is hardly a philosophical issue. It's a matter of cleanliness. Similarly, anti-Semitism is a hygienic measure that we have been forced to endure. While evolution teaches the idea of favored races, the Bible says that God hath made of one blood all nations of men, and that mankind was given dominion over every living thing upon the face of all the earth. The Lord said to Noah, surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. But if God did not create men, under what authority should a man's person be protected?
I've asked evolutionists all over the country, if evolution is true, I have a simple question. How do we tell right from wrong? How does anybody tell right from wrong if evolution is true? A simple fact is you can't tell right from wrong. There's no such thing as right or wrong if evolution is true. Might makes right. Whoever's the strongest, they get their way. The biggest lion gets the zebra. And that's kind of the way evolution theory ends up. The bottom line is there's no standard for right and wrong, no moral base whatsoever. And I think the theory is not only dumb, I think it's very dangerous.
Shortly after Darwin's theory was published, a man named Christopher Columbus Langdell became dean of Harvard Law School. Langdell believed wholeheartedly in Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. He also believed that as man evolved, his laws must also evolve. Langdell introduced the now famous case law method into the American legal system. In his book on the history of American education, author and researcher Von Schatzer writes that case law basically means judges would interpret the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights as they believed it should be interpreted, not necessarily in accordance with the intent of the Founding Fathers. In case law, should the judge or judges not believe in God or the Bible, Christian principles or values would not be used. If judges did not believe abortion was murder, they ruled accordingly. If judges did not believe homosexuality was wrong, they ruled accordingly. Sir William Blackstone's famous commentaries on the law were used for about 160 years by American lawyers, courts, U.S. Senate, and law schools to settle disputes, to define words, and to examine procedure. Thomas Jefferson once stated that the influence of Blackstone's commentaries on law was so strong on American lawyers they were used with the same dedication and reverence that Muslims use the Quran. But in the 1930s, Blackstone's commentaries that were based on biblical principles were discarded in favor of the evolutionary case law method. The first major decision the courts made using the case law method was in 1962, the removal of prayer from schools. The Supreme Court reached decisions in 1962 and 1963 that declared prayer and the reading of Bible verses in public schools to be unconstitutional. This is ironic when one considers that the American school system was originally established for the purpose of teaching the Bible to all Americans. Perhaps the chief reason every American child learns to read can be traced to an early American law known as the Old Deluder-Satan Act, established in 1647. The law began with the words, "It being one chief object of that old deluder, Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures as in former times. For this reason," the law stated, that children must learn to read and write so they would be able to read the Bible for themselves and avoid the errors of the Dark Ages. Many researchers today consider it of great significance that the 1960s brought an end to an American standard in education that stood for more than 300 years.
In the early 60s, in 63, prayer was taken out of our schools. And right then, from 1963 on, is when we saw a great rise in sexually transmitted diseases, illegal drug use, child abuse, premarital sex. I mean, just all kinds of moral indicators began to fall. America particularly began to fall apart in the early 1960s morally. I think largely because of the introduction of this evolution theory into our textbooks, which says there's no God, there's no way to determine right from wrong.
While biblical teachings on the creation have been removed from schools, the pagan doctrine of evolution has deceptively replaced them. Evolution is perhaps most clearly seen in the Hindu teaching of reincarnation.
Dying and living, this endless cycle of reincarnation. This is the basis of Hindu Eastern mystical thinking, evolution, that there was death that came into the world. Now God says that He created a perfect world. A perfect world, there was no death.
According to the Bible, death entered the world through Adam when he sinned with Eve in the garden. Prior to Adam's sin, there was no death.
Sin brought in death, and God killed the first possibly lamb. The animal sacrifice, the first animal sacrifice, was committed by God Himself, who covered the sinners with a covering for sin. And this was a foreshadowing of what He would do through Jesus Christ, that there would be a death and a blood sacrifice to cover sin. So to say that there was death before life and this endless cycle of reincarnation and evolution, which is synonymous, that the two of them go together, is unbiblical. So here we have in schools today, for instance, a faith that undergirds paganism, heathenism, mystical Eastern thinking, which is evolution, which is now being taught in schools as part of a conditioning process, whereas creationism has been taken out of schools because they say it's religious because it comes from the Bible. So you've got one faith, the faith on how the world began, creationism, taken out of the classroom because it's not scientific, but you've got another faith that undergirds Eastern mysticism, evolution, being brought into the classroom, called a science.
But why did evolutionary theory gain such strength and power in a nation founded on biblical principles? And how did so many come to believe that evolution is fact rather than theory? The mainstream offers the following view, which seems typical.
Before the 19th century, Western man looked to the Bible for an explanation of his origins. In the story of Genesis, God created man from the dust of the earth 6,000 years ago. But when man dug into the earth for answers, he found evidence that appeared to tell a different story. Evolution.
But is this really what happened? Did the physical evidence give man reason to doubt the biblical account? Or did man create a theory and then go looking for some way to prove it? Modern sources, like this documentary hosted by Charlton Heston, have begun to admit that this was indeed the case.
When Darwin's theory of evolution was embraced, it was assumed that in the next century enough fossil evidence would be found to prove that man had evolved from the apes.
Darwinists have promised us a missing link, and so they've got to deliver. They've got to come up with one. Any missing link will do, it seems. Any missing link will do, it seems.
Darwin published his theory in 1859. It was half a century later before any evidence arrived to support it. In 1912, British scientist Charles Dawson made the Piltdown Man discovery and changed the world. Piltdown Man was considered the missing link, supposedly the skull and jawbone of a half-man, half-ape mutation. It convinced millions that Darwin's theory was scientifically proved. But in 1953, some 40 years later, Piltdown was declared a hoax.
It was somebody taking a human skull and an ape's jawbone. They broke off the joint where they would fit together so they couldn't tell, then filed them down, made them look really old, and buried them in a gravel pit. It was a hoax, a deliberate, either a joke, which they never told anybody about for 40 years, or a lie to try to prove the evolution theory.
In either case, it may be said that no other discovery in the 20th century has had as great an impact on furthering evolution than Piltdown. Stephen Jay Gould writes that Piltdown absorbed the professional attention of many fine scientists. It led millions of people astray for 40 years. Researcher Richard Harder reports that more than 500 articles and memoirs were written on the Piltdown finds before the hoax was exposed. Likewise, articles in encyclopedias and sections in textbooks and popular books of science, an immense amount of derivative work. For many years, the Piltdown finds were a significant percentage of the fossils which were used to reconstruct human ancestry. In his book, The Piltdown Forgery, J.S. Weiner remarks that this ill-begotten form of primitive man received nearly as much attention as all the legitimate specimens in the fossil record put together. Yet once the hoax was exposed, the scientific community failed to repent of its error. The damage had already been done, and a generation of evolutionary thought had been born. Dawson himself never lived to be exposed. He died shortly after his famous discovery in 1916. While controversy over the hoax continues, today the BBC refers to Dawson as the Piltdown Faker. They write that of his discoveries, at least 38 are fakes. The only suspect in these frauds is Charles Dawson himself, the same man who uncovered the remains of Eanthropus dawsoni, the Piltdown Man. BBC concludes that for Charles Dawson, Piltdown was not a one-off hoax, more the culmination of a life's work. Yet Dawson did not act alone. His partner in the Piltdown affair was a young paleontologist and Roman Catholic Jesuit priest named Pierre Teilhard du Chardin.
I tend to believe, and a Catholic priest named Pierre de Chardin was involved in this also, and he really pushed evolution on the Catholic Church because he said, oh, we got proof, we got this half man, half monkey.
After Dawson's death, Teilhard would become heir to the find of the century and may be the man most responsible for the normalization of evolutionary thinking in Western culture today. Teilhard would go on to work in China and take part in the now famous Peking Man discovery, a collection of would-be missing links that mysteriously disappeared in 1941 before anyone could fully examine them. Of 175 fossil fragments recorded, all were supposedly lost. Only the notes and photographs taken by Teilhard and his team of scientists remain. Modern critics question the integrity of the find because of Teilhard's association with Charles Dawson, the Piltdown Faker. But Teilhard's scientific deceptions are minor when compared to the theological abyss that he sought to drag himself and humanity into. He wrote, "Is evolution a theory, a system, or a hypothesis? It is much more. It is the general condition to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must bow, and which they must satisfy henceforward if they are to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light illuminating all facts, a curve that all lines must follow." Treated as an apostate by the Vatican, banned from teaching, and forbidden to publish his writings, Teilhard became the hero of sophisticated Protestants and then returned to the good graces of Rome 26 years after his death. The Catholic Church, that once rejected evolutionary thinking, seems to have been among those who bowed to its hypothesis, largely due to the influence of Teilhard, who had become a hero and role model for a whole generation of younger priests and theologians. He set the stage for the renewal movements, which finally came to flower in the era of Vatican II. Vatican II is the Catholic document that launched the ecumenical movement for the purpose of ultimately unifying mankind in a universal faith. Evolution plays a key role in ecumenism since the pagan religions of the world are largely based on its precepts. Under Pope John Paul II, Rome now considers evolution to be a part of the gospel truth. It is reported that the Pope has put the teaching authority of the Roman Catholic Church firmly behind the view that the human body is the product of a gradual process of evolution. But the influence of this Jesuit priest would reach far beyond the walls of Rome. In 1985, author Marilyn Ferguson published her controversial book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, which USA Today called the Handbook of the New Age. In it, Ferguson describes a worldwide conspiracy of people seeking to bring about a paradigm shift in global consciousness. In the Los Angeles Times, Marilyn Ferguson revealed that Teilhard was the name most frequently mentioned by 185 leaders in the New Age movement when Ferguson asked who was the most influential person in their lives. By the end of the 20th century, Teilhard du Chardin would be known by many as the father of the New Age. Teilhard died in 1955, but his passing only marked the beginning of his meteoric rise to fame. His treatises, long suppressed, were published and quickly translated into all major languages. Harvard's Widener Library now houses an entire tier of books devoted to Teilhard's writing and thinking. Today, more and more people, Christians as well as non-Christians, accept his views and take keen interest in studying his philosophy. He has become known for his theory that man is evolving mentally and socially toward a final spiritual unity. Andrew Jackson Davis, known by some as the prophet of the New Revelation, channeled a message from the spirit realm that called for the paleontological sciences to direct man's perception of God through the study of nature. Is it merely coincidence that Teilhard du Chardin, a priest and paleontologist, would lead the way into the dawn of a new age? Researcher Charles P. Henderson writes, this paleontologist and Jesuit priest made it his personal mission to reconstruct the most basic Christian doctrines from the perspectives of science. He would do this by overthrowing all the barriers that had been erected between science and religion. He would take the lessons learned from the study of nature as the foundation on which to reconstruct the Christian faith. After the similar examples of Swedenborg, Phineas Quimby, and Mary Baker Eddy, Teilhard sought to deny the reality of sin and openly rejected the biblical gospel. In 1947, Teilhard said, very definitely there was no Adam and no Eve and no original sin. He wrote that original sin continually obstructs the natural expansion of our religion. It is a straitjacket that checks any movement of heart or head. It binds us hand and foot and drains the blood from us because it represents a survival of static concepts that are an anachronism in our evolutionist system of thought. A Catholic newsletter says that in the theology of Teilhard, we are all becoming Christ. There is no original sin, and therefore no need of redemption. Evolutionary forces are ferrying everyone along to godhood, and all are anonymous Christians making faith in the literal death and resurrection of Christ unnecessary. The American Atheist magazine understands the situation too well. It writes, "Destroy Adam and Eve and original sin, and in the rubble you will find the sorry remains of the Son of God, and take away the meaning of his death." But did Teilhard intend to undermine the Christ of the Bible? Some have thought so, since Teilhard's evolutionary teachings parallel Eastern mysticism and pagan theology.
The whole Eastern pagan theological worldview is to undermine the deity of Christ and to elevate the deity of humanity. So Eastern mysticism, paganism, is talking about the God within. The way they Christianize it is by saying Christ is within me. I am the Christ, or the Antichrist that's going to come is the Christ, or the Lord, the Maitreya. So all of it is actually lessening the work of Christ, and man is elevated to a Christ-like person. And you'll find that in most of the cults, they will not give, Christ is not given the position of deity.
Another researcher writes that Roman Catholic scholar Pierre Teilhard du Chardin taught that the God to be worshipped is the one who will arise out of the evolving human race. Surely man's desire echoes Lucifer's proud boast. The book of Isaiah says of him, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High."
I will, I will, I will. You know, this guy's an egomaniac, self-deceived egomaniac. I think he really thinks he's going to win the battle with God. Anyway, he said, I will be like the Most High. I mean, you got to be really deluded even to say that. That's the impossible dream. How many Most Highs can there be? I mean, you can't have. That's why God is called the Most High God. Okay? Now, there are a lot of other pretender gods, but he says to them, Jeremiah 10, verses 10 and 11, I'm the true God that created this universe. You say to the gods who have not made this heaven and earth, they will perish from under this heaven and from this earth. So, in that one ambition, I will be like the Most High, Lucifer did away with monotheism, one true God. He introduced polytheism. There will be many gods. Well, I'll be one of them. In fact, he's going to be the supreme one.